My daughter-in-law seated me at the kids' table. Then she stood in the dining room, lifted her champagne glass, and thanked the people who had truly built this life. I paid for that life. And before dessert was served, I called my attorney. If you've ever smiled through disrespect because the people hurting you were family, stay with me. And if stories like this hit a little too close to home, subscribe now. Because some betrayals do not arrive as screaming matches. Some arrive on linen napkins, candlelight, and a place card with your name missing from the table. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 74 years old. I was widowed 9 years ago. And until that anniversary party, I believed I had made peace with the quiet humiliations that come with getting older inside a family where your usefulness has outlived your visibility. I had not made peace with them. I had adapted to them. That is not the same thing. The party was for my son Daniel and his wife Claire. 20 years of marriage. 20 years of polished photographs, expensive schools, beautiful homes, and the kind of elegant life people admire without ever asking who exactly paid for the polish. Claire was very good at surfaces. The house in Greenwich was full of flowers, candlelight, caterers, and string music in the garden. Everything looked beautiful. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked seamless. I wore navy silk, pearl earrings, and I brought a bottle of Bordeaux Walter had once saved for a truly meaningful family celebration. I believed I was coming as family. That was my mistake. The first crack came when I saw the dining table. Long table. Crystal. Linen. Tall candles. Place cards in black script. I looked once. Then twice. Claire's parents. Daniel. Claire. Their friends. Their business guests. The twins. Even the French tutor. Know me. I assumed it was an oversight. Kind women do that. We donate accidental explanations to deliberate slights because the alternative is too painful to name. Then Claire floated over in a gold dress and said, "Oh, Eleanor, we've put you in the breakfast room with the children. We thought you'd be more comfortable there." More comfortable there. The breakfast room was off the kitchen. Small table. Juice glasses. Chicken tenders. Coloring sheets. Too much noise for adult conversation. I looked into the dining room. My son was there. Wine glass in hand. Laughing with a man from his firm. Not looking at me. That was the moment. Not because the room was smaller. Not because the food was simpler. Because in one polished sentence, Claire assigned me my place in the life I had helped fund. Not honored. Not central. Not family in the real sense. Just manageable. Useful. Containable. I smiled. Of course I smiled. Women of my generation have survived entire lifetimes on smiles that concealed blood loss. I said, "How thoughtful." Then I sat at the children's table, between a boy with ketchup on his sleeve and a little girl wearing glitter cat ears. And from the next room I heard the toast. Claire lifted her glass and thanked the people who had truly built this life with us. I looked at my plate, then into the next room, then at my son smiling, and something inside me went cold. Not broken. Cold. There's a difference. Breaking is emotional. Cold is useful. I left before dessert. No one tried to stop me. Outside, the evening smelled like roses and catering fuel. I walked down the stone path, took out my phone, and called my attorney. That was the last moment in my life when Daniel and Claire still believed I was just an old woman with hurt feelings. By the next morning, I was auditing 20 years of their dependence. The truth is, the children's table did not create the wound. It revealed it. Because that dinner was not an isolated insult. It was simply the first time the insult had been lit properly. There had been signs for years. Of course there had. Cruelty rarely begins at full volume. It begins as preference, as tone, as correction, as laughter at the wrong moment, as an elegant little dismissal that leaves no bruise anyone else can point to. I met Claire when she was 26. Beautiful. Poised. Always in cream or pale gold. As if softness itself were part of her wardrobe strategy. I liked her immediately. That is one of the more embarrassing truths of my life. I liked her because she was quick. Because she seemed certain. Because after years of watching Daniel drift toward women who felt vague and unfinished, Claire arrived like someone who had already decided who she was. I thought that would be good for him. And in some ways it was. She polished him. Sharpened him socially. refined his edges. But she also discovered very early that my son hated discomfort more than he valued clarity. And once a woman discovers that about a man, she can build almost anything on it. The first hint came at Christmas, their second year married. I hosted as I always did. Candles, turkey, silver polished, proper table. Claire arrived late with an expensive tart no one had asked her to bring and spent the first 15 minutes telling me how the table should be rebalanced. Then she handed me a pile of coats and said, "Would you mind hanging these, Eleanor? You're so good at the domestic touches." I remember standing in the hallway with 6 coats over my arms while I heard laughter from the living room and realized I had just been turned into staff with one sentence elegant enough that objecting would have made me look ridiculous. Daniel noticed. Of course he noticed. Did he say anything? No. That was the beginning. Then came the twins. Oliver and Caroline. Beautiful children. Difficult infants. Claire called often in those years. At first because she was overwhelmed. Then because I was useful. I drove to Greenwich 3 times a week. Sometimes more. I brought casseroles. Held babies. Folded laundry. Managed bottles. Walked the floor while Claire slept. I did those things gladly. That part matters. Not all exploitation begins as exploitation. Some of it begins inside love. But then the language changed. Could you come help? Became you'll come Thursday, won't you? Would you mind staying a bit later? Became you can just stay through bedtime. And gratitude slowly dissolved into assumption. One afternoon, I arrived after a frantic voicemail and found Claire dressed for lunch with friends. She handed me a diaper bag and said, "You're a lifesaver. I knew you wouldn't mind." Then she kissed the babies and left. No discussion. No question. No recognition that my time also had a shape. Later that evening, Daniel came home and said, "Mom, thank you. Claire's been under so much pressure." Not "I'm sorry," she presumed. Not "you shouldn't have been put in that position." Just gratitude for my usefulness. That became the rhythm. Usefulness mistaken for closeness. Access mistaken for love. Then the money started following the same pattern. Never demanded crudely. That would have offended me. No, it always came dressed in the language of family progress. A small bridge for the down payment. A temporary gap for the kitchen renovation. A necessary networking expense for the club membership. A special educational opportunity for the twins. A summer shortfall. A travel reimbursement. A professional dues adjustment. Each request just reasonable enough. Each explanation just polished enough. Each time I helped. Because I could. Because I loved them. Because helping felt easier than stopping to ask what kind of adults were being built on the other side of my help. By the time Claire seated me at the children's table, I had already paid for far more than one dinner. The next morning I was about to find out exactly how much. When I called Charles from the driveway that night, I already knew this was not about one party. I knew it in my bones. What I did not know was the number. The real number. The one that would turn hurt into structure. I arrived at Charles's office the next morning at 9 o'clock sharp. He had 6 folders waiting. 2 junior associates. 1 paralegal. And an expression that told me he understood this was not a dramatic reaction. This was administrative grief. The dangerous kind. He listened while I told him everything. The placement. The toast. The years. The pattern. Then he said very quietly, "So the event was not the children's table. It was the meaning of the children's table." Exactly. That is why I trusted Charles. He understood that harm in affluent families is often committed through implication, not noise. Then he opened the folders. House down payment. $40,000. Given through a property vehicle because Daniel and Claire wanted the right start. Kitchen renovation financing. Quietly covered and later forgiven. Private. Club initiation and renewals. Paid through a family entity Daniel assumed was some kind of business-related reimbursement. The twins' school enhancements. Summer support. Travel supplements. Holiday transfers. Emergency liquidity during Daniel's partnership track years. And then the larger things. Forgiven notes. Gifted securities. Trust distributions redirected toward comfort and image. By the time Charles finished, the number sat between us like architecture. $2.8 million. I stared at it for a long time. Not because I needed the money. That was never the point. Because I suddenly saw the full size of the stage I had built for people who had seated me beside children eating chicken tenders. $2.8 million. For a life in which I was useful enough to finance but not central enough to honor. Charles folded his hands. What would you like to do? I did not answer immediately. Because decisions like that are not emotional even when they begin in pain. They are structural. You do not remove one support beam because you are angry. You remove it because the building has been leaning on it without permission for too long. I said, anything discretionary, stop. Anything that cushions their adulthood at my expense, remove. Anything built on the assumption that I will always pay, revoke. He nodded. Education structures? Protect principal. Tighten used terms. No parent-managed luxuries. Real estate support? End it. Annual discretionary distributions? Gone. Club reimbursements? Gone. And Daniel's expectation letter? I looked up sharply. My what? Charles slid the paper toward me. Apparently Daniel had used a forward-looking expectation letter tied to one of my entities as quiet support for an expansion move. Expectation letter. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so perfect. My son had not only assumed my generosity would continue. He had already started building his future on the assumption that I would never stop paying. That was when anger became clarity. Revoke it, I said. By early afternoon, notices were drafting. Quietly. Legally. Thoroughly. No screaming. No broken glass. No family meeting at a long dining table. Just signatures. Letters. Structures dissolving in real time. That is how real power works. And somewhere in Greenwich, my son and his wife still had no idea the floor beneath their lives was already shifting. 3 days later, the first letters reached them. And the first person to call me was not Claire. It was my son. Daniel called first. That mattered. Because it meant he understood immediately that something practical had just happened. Not emotional. Not symbolic. Practical. His voice was tight the moment I answered. What is this? I let the silence sit just long enough to force him to continue. Charles says the RI support line is terminated. The tuition extras are frozen. The club reimbursement is gone. My expansion backing has been withdrawn. What the hell is happening? I said. You seated me at the children's table. There was a pause. Then that flat, incredulous laugh men use when they think a woman must be exaggerating because the alternative would require them to admit she understood perfectly what happened. Are you serious right now? Yes. You're doing all of this over a party seating issue? No. I am ending a 20-year structure built on the assumption that I exist to fund people who do not respect me. Mom, that is insane. No, Daniel. What is insane is that you think this is about one dinner. It is about every dinner. Every assumption. Every holiday. Every year in which I was useful enough to pay and unimportant enough to honor. He exhaled hard. Then he made the mistake I knew he would make. You can't do this without talking to us first. That line told me everything. In his mind, my money had become part of the family atmosphere. Not mine. Not gifted. Not discretionary. Atmospheric. Like heat in the winter. Something that did not belong to anyone in particular because it was simply always there. I just did talk to you, I said. This is that conversation. You're punishing us. No. I am withdrawing support from adults who have confused help with entitlement. You're throwing the twins into instability because Claire hurt your feelings. That one almost got me. Not because it was true. Because it was strategically cruel. The children. Always the children. Families like ours use children the way corporations use branding. As emotional shields. I am not destabilizing the twins, I said. I am requiring their parents to support the life they chose to create. You know what the market is like. You know what our expenses are. Yes, I said. I know your expenses because I've been paying for too many of them. The silence that followed was not empty. It was Daniel realizing the conversation had moved into a register he did not know how to control. For years, I had absorbed his discomfort before it could reach him. Now it was reaching him. Unfiltered. And he did not like the climate. Mom, he said more quietly, Claire didn't mean it the way you're taking it. There it is. What? The sentence that has protected her for 20 years. That's unfair. No. What's unfair is that your wife can rearrange my place in the family, and you call my response a misunderstanding. She was trying to manage the room. She managed me into irrelevance. He did not answer that. Because he couldn't. He had seen it. He had just chosen not to stop it. That is what weak men do. They call themselves peacekeepers when really they are simply outsourcing courage to the women who love them. At the end of the call he said, "Claire is going to call you." I know. She's upset. I imagine so. And if we come to the city to talk? You may come. Then I hung up. I sat for a long time after that. Not crying. Not pacing. Just feeling the strange quiet that arrives when you realize your son has built an entire emotional life on the assumption that you will never make him uncomfortable. And then I realized something else. This was the first honest conversation we had had in years. Painful, but honest. And that honesty had only become possible once I removed the money. Claire called less than 20 minutes later. And unlike Daniel, she knew exactly which version of herself to send first. Claire did not call with anger. Not at first. Women like Claire understand something very important. Rage is the second costume. Tears are the first. "Eleanor," she said softly, "I had no idea you felt this way. If I had known, you knew enough." "No, I really didn't. I thought you preferred being with the children. You're so wonderful with them." There it was. The insult converted into compliment. The demotion disguised as flattery. "You placed me where you place the people you do not need to impress. That's not fair." "No," I said. "It isn't." She changed tactics quickly. "Do you understand what this is going to do to Daniel? To the children? To our household? Do you understand what your treatment did to me?" Silence. Not apology. Recognition. That mattered. Because Claire was not incapable of understanding. She was accustomed to not needing to. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. The truth would be a start. The truth is that the dinner was crowded, the children needed supervision, and I thought you would be comfortable there. You thanked the people who built your life in a room I was not invited to sit in. She didn't answer. Because some truths cannot be walked around elegantly once they are named plainly. Then she tried the next move. "We have always loved you, Eleanor." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it was so insufficient. "Love without respect," I said, "is usually just convenience with better language." Another silence. That landed. It landed because Claire understood language. And she understood that what I had just done was name the mechanism cleanly. When she spoke again, there was steel under the softness. "If you go through with this, the children will feel it. They already have." What is that supposed to mean? It means children know when adults are lying about family long before they can explain it. "Eleanor, this is spiraling." "No. Claire. This is clarifying." That was the last thing I said before ending the call. Afterward, I walked through my apartment and noticed, not for the first time, how different silence feels when you are no longer spending it on other people's comfort. I looked at the art, the books, the city beyond the glass, and I realized I had not been deprived by helping Daniel and Claire. I had been diminished by it. There is a difference. The first costs money. The second costs identity. By the end of the week, they called to ask if they could come to the city. Both of them. I said yes. Not because I wanted reconciliation on their terms. Because if people are finally going to see you, it may as well happen in a room that reflects who you really are. They came on Friday afternoon. And watching them step into my apartment told me they had misunderstood me for far longer than even I had realized. Claire had never been to my Park Avenue apartment. Daniel had twice. Both times for events he barely remembered because he had treated them as extensions of my convenience, not revelations of who I actually was. Watching them step into that apartment was almost worth the 20 years it took to get there. The elevator opened directly into the foyer. Marble floor. Antique console. 3 oil paintings I bought with Walter in our 40s. A chandelier soft enough not to scream, expensive enough not to need to. Claire paused half a step inside and looked around with the expression of someone who has just stepped into a social category she didn't know belonged to you. Daniel looked angry first, then unsettled. then suddenly younger. That happens to sons when they realize they have misunderstood their mothers for too long. I did not offer wine. Only water. That was deliberate. No one drinks while we are discussing moral architecture. We sat in the library. No children. No buffers. No performance audience. Daniel started first. Fast. Money. Stress. Timing. Overreaction. Claire followed with tone, context, emotional nuance, and all the verbal silk she had always used to soften hard furniture. I let them speak. That too was deliberate. People reveal more when they think they are still explaining themselves into power. Then I said, "Do either of you know how much I have given your household since your marriage?" Silence. Charles, seated beside me, slid the summary across the table. Daniel read first. Then again. Claire took it from him. Her face changed. $2.8 million. I let the number remain between us. Not because I wanted to shock them. Because numbers are honest in ways families often are not. Claire spoke first. "This can't be right." "It is. We never asked for. You never had to ask. That is part of the problem." Daniel put the papers down. "You're making us sound like thieves." "No," I said. "I am describing you as dependents who mistook generosity for structure and structure for entitlement." Claire's eyes filled. Not because she finally felt my pain. Because the architecture of her life had just become visible to her. All at once. That is a brutal thing to see. Especially when you have spent years narrating yourself as self-made. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "what do you want from us?" There it was. Not how do we restore the money. Not what happens to the school. Not what about the house. The real question. What is the price of moral repair? I said 3 things. First, the money is not returning in its old form. Second, the children will be protected, but you will not be cushioned from adulthood through me anymore. Third, if I remain in your lives, it will be as a person with rank, dignity, and boundaries, not as the invisible scaffolding under your lifestyle. Daniel stared at the rug. Claire stared at me. Then Daniel said something I had waited years to hear, though not in this form. "I think I've been letting Claire manage the emotional temperature of our family because it was easier than growing a spine. There are moments when a son becomes a man late. That was one of them." Claire flinched. "I did not rescue her. Rescue is what built this." I said, "Good. Now we are finally in the room with the truth." The truth did not make the next few months beautiful. It made them real. And reality was about to become very expensive. The months after that meeting were not graceful. Growth rarely is. The first thing to go was the house. Not because Daniel and Claire were destitute. Because they had been living above the truth. Greenwich had only worked because I had been quietly patting its edges. The support line was gone. The extras were gone. The illusion that their income naturally matched their life was gone. So they sold. There were tears. There were tense real estate meetings. There were explanations to neighbors phrased in ways that tried very hard not to sound like what they were. A forced descent into reality. The twins moved. Schools. That hurt. Of course it hurt. Children should not have to learn economics through adult pride. But they adapted faster than their parents did. Children often do. They ask cleaner questions. Will we still see our friends? Is the new school okay? Why is everyone so upset? Adults are the ones who drown in the symbolic meaning of change. Children usually just want to know where the crayons are and whether the new room has sunlight. Daniel and Claire bought a smaller house in Rye. No club. No magazine kitchen. No long dining room that needed to perform status on command. No decorative adulthood underwritten by my silence. For a while Daniel was angry. Not openly cruel. Just brittle. That tired adolescent anger wealthy adult children sometimes develop when reality first touches them and they realize they are not, in fact, self-sustaining. Claire was different. Quieter. More careful. And to my surprise, slowly more honest. The first time she called me just to ask how a medical appointment went, I almost didn't know how to answer. Not because the question was difficult. Because it was new. She had never before asked about my body unless logistics depended on the answer. That is how low the bar had been. One day, while we were having tea in my apartment, her invitation, not mine, Claire said, "I think I've spent years arranging my life so carefully that I forgot people are not furniture." It was not an apology exactly, but it was one of the first sentences she had ever said to me that felt like a clean observation rather than a strategic one. I told her, "That is a better beginning than most people ever manage." Daniel's evolution was slower. That is often the case with sons. They have to grieve not only the loss of comfort, but the loss of the self-image that comfort allowed them to keep. He had thought of himself as responsible, generous, hard-working, and he was all those things in part. But he was also a man who had quietly built future plans on the assumption that his mother would continue paying the difference forever. Once he saw that, it altered him. Not immediately, but steadily. One afternoon he came alone and said, "I think I've always interpreted your capacity as your duty." That sentence nearly broke my heart, because it was true. Not only of him, of many people. When someone strong loves you deeply and makes life easier, it is very tempting to decide that ease is simply part of the natural order. It takes maturity to recognize that someone's capacity does not create your entitlement. And then Christmas came. The first Christmas after the children's table. And Claire did one thing that told me she had finally understood what the table had meant. Christmas that year was at the new house in Rye. Smaller, warmer, less performative. No hired quartet. No custom napkins. No architectural pretense. Just a family dinner in a house that actually fit the life inside it. I arrived early, by invitation. No one handed me coats. No one redirected me toward tasks. Claire met me at the door herself, took my arm, and said quietly, "I'd like you to see where I put your card." The dining table was already set. Not grand, beautiful but honest. And there, at one end of the table was my name. At the head. Not because it was my house. Not because I paid. Because she had finally understood what the head of a table means. Not dominance. Acknowledgement. History. Weight. Rank. I looked at the card for a long time, then at her. And she said, "I know this doesn't fix what happened, but I needed you to know I understand what I did now." That mattered. More than flowers. More than expensive apologies. Symbolic damage needs symbolic repair. Daniel was different that Christmas too. Still not fully comfortable. Still carrying some shame. But honest enough now to let it be visible. At one point while pouring wine he said, "I think I've spent my whole life assuming you would absorb the things I didn't want to confront." I said, "That is true." He nodded. No defensiveness. No explanation. Just truth. That, in some ways, was the largest gift he had ever given me. The children were fine. Better than fine. They had adapted to the new school. Made friends. Lost interest in the old symbols much faster than their parents. Oliver talked to me about science projects. Caroline wanted to show me a sketchbook. Neither of them cared. About club memberships, dining room scale, or whether the kitchen had appeared in a regional magazine. That too was instructive. So much of what adults destroy each other over has nothing to do with what children actually need. After dinner, Claire brought me tea in the sitting room and asked, "Do you think we'll ever be what we should have been with you?" I considered the question carefully. Then I said, "No. But I think we can become something true, and at our age that may be more valuable." She nodded. And for once she did not try to smooth the sentence into something prettier. That is how I knew she was changing. A few months later, Daniel came to see me alone. And what he said in my library was the first thing that made me believe my son had truly become an adult. It was a gray afternoon in February when Daniel came alone. No Claire. No children. No buffer. He sat in the library where the winter light made the city look like a steel drawing and said, "I'm starting to understand how much easier it was to let you be generous than to really know you." That line nearly broke me, because it was true. Not just for him. For many people. It is easier to consume love than to meet the person giving it. For years, Daniel had preferred the version of me that made his life easier. That did not make him evil. It made him common. And common failures in families can do almost as much damage as monstrous ones. He went on. "I think I've spent my whole adult life treating your competence as atmosphere. I didn't think of it as sacrifice because you never made me look at it." There it was. The other half of the truth. I had hidden myself. Not maliciously, but thoroughly enough that the people closest to me mistook restraint for limitation. I told him, I thought if I stayed smaller you would feel taller. He laughed once. Not from amusement. From recognition. And instead, he said, I just stopped looking down far enough to notice what I was standing on. That sentence sat with me long after he left. Because it names something that goes beyond our family. Many parents, especially mothers, dim themselves out of love. They think they are giving confidence, space, independence. But what they sometimes give instead is permission. Permission to be overlooked. Permission to be underestimated. Permission to be used without anyone quite admitting that is what they are doing. After Daniel left, I stood by the window and looked out over the city and realized something almost embarrassing in its simplicity. I did not miss the money. I did not miss the role. What I had missed all those years was being visible. Not useful. Visible. There is a difference that some families never learn. Mine almost didn't. By spring, my life had become fuller than it had been in years. And the strangest part was this: losing my position in their illusion gave me back my place in my own life. By spring, my life had changed in ways that had nothing to do with Daniel and Claire and everything to do with me. That was the part one had not expected. I resumed more active work in the family trust and foundations. Not because I needed the money, because I needed the mind of it. I hosted dinners in my apartment for people who knew exactly who I was, and had never required me to diminish myself to make them comfortable. I traveled more. Not extravagantly, elegantly. A week in Vienna. 4 quiet days in Charleston. A charity board retreat in Santa Fe. I bought myself things I liked without mentally translating them into what they might have paid for in someone else's life. That felt radical. Not because it was selfish. Because women of my generation are trained to treat self-regard like theft. It is not theft. It is oxygen. Claire and I are not best friends. I doubt we ever will be. Some relationships are not meant to become soft. Only honest. And honesty, in my view, is a higher form of peace than false warmth. Daniel and I are better than we were. Not because he apologized once. Because he learned to see. The twins are thriving. They call more often than either of their parents. Which amuses me. Children, when they are not trained out of it, often recognize sincerity faster than adults do. I do not regret helping my family. Let me say that clearly. I regret helping without being seen. I regret allowing contribution to replace conversation. I regret thinking love was enough protection against being turned into infrastructure. Because that is what happens. When you give without boundaries long enough, people stop seeing the gift. They only experience the convenience. And once you become convenience, your face disappears. You become the lights, the heat, the steady wire in the wall. Necessary. Invisible. Then one day when you finally turn off the current, everyone calls it betrayal. It isn't betrayal. It is revelation. If there is one lesson in my story, it is not that family should never help family. Family should help. Gladly. Generously. But help without respect becomes infrastructure. And once you become infrastructure in someone else's life, they stop seeing your face. They only notice the lights when you turn them off. So tell me honestly, if your son and daughter-in-law seated you at the children's table while toasting the life you helped pay for, what would you have done? Would you have smiled and swallowed it? Would you have left and never looked back? Or would you have called your attorney before dessert? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever had to teach your own family that love is not the same thing as access, subscribe. Because some stories are not just stories. Some are warnings. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.